Welcome on behalf of the National Press Club and the National Press Club Journalism Institute. I'm so happy you are joining us here in this room and joining us on C-SPAN. I am Julie Moose. I'm the executive director of the National Press Club Journalism Institute, where we are working to close the gap between journalism and civic engagement. And this is a really important program in service to that mission. So I want to tell you a little bit about how it came about. Back in April, Ava DuVernay was given an honor at the museum, part of the Free Expression Awards. And as she accepted her honor, she talked about Nipsey Hussle. She dedicated it to him. And she talked about the LA Times and their coverage. And I want to show you what she said.
And so tonight I want to dedicate this award to someone who did just that. Someone who was and is important and who used his art in dynamic ways. He's a rap artist, an entrepreneurial activist from the part of the country that I'm from, very close to Compton, where I grew up. His name is Nipsey Hussle. He told the truth through his art. The truth of his family, his feelings, his block, his community, his city, his world, his dreams, his demands, his actions, his ideas, his love for his people. His loss has echoed throughout the world. His life viewed as the triumph that it is and was and will long be. This week, I've been motivated and deeply moved by the press coverage of this brother from South Central Los Angeles, specifically an area in South Central LA that we call the 60s. His life has galvanized a press response that has become a real powerful moment for me and so many people who so rarely see that kind of attention given to people like him. The LA Times, our city newspaper, in a front page spread with a huge, beautiful headline. The headline wrote, "A Legend in His City." They published a tribute article days after Nipsey's murder, written by a Black reporter, Gerrick Kennedy, profiling the totality of Nipsey's talent and intention with great insight, understanding, and sensitivity. I gasped when I saw it. The layout, the words, the way that they had honored him on the page. It was another Black journalist, Nicole Hannah-Jones of the New York Times, who tweeted that the layout and the love shown by the LA Times was, quote, such a profound example of why it's so critical to hire journalists who are of the cultures that they are writing about as often as possible. The depth of knowledge, the intuitive gravitas is so important. Gerrick did Nipsey justice. Salute. That was her tweet.
Yeah, it's really powerful. So soon after that, I was talking to a colleague and friend, Jill Geisler, about our mission, and she had also been at the museum that night. And I was telling her how central trust and representation was to what we were trying to accomplish. And she said, find out how the LA Times did it. And so enter Del Wilbur, who may have invited some of you here tonight. Del is a member of the National Press Club Board of Governors, and he connected us to the right people at the LA Times. And they were eager, as you'll hear, to talk about how this coverage came about, what led up to this moment, and what's followed it. And we enlisted Kimberly Adams, who is also a member of the National Press Club Board of Governors and a correspondent at Marketplace. And Kimberly's going to introduce our LA Times team, and we'll go from there. Thank you, Kimberly.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. Thank you all so much for coming out tonight for this incredibly important topic. I think if any of you have a chance after this is all done to go back and look at some of the amazing stories that the LA Times did, I think that would be of a great benefit to you, and it's really astounding coverage. So I'll introduce our wonderful panel here. First to my left is Angel Jennings. Hey, Angel.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for having me.
Angel Jennings is a reporter for the Metro section of the Los Angeles Times. She covers issues that affect residents in South Los Angeles. Since joining the Times in 2011, Angel has written for the business section and covered education. She is a native of Washington, D.C. Pause for applause. And graduated from the University of Nebraska. And next to her, oh, even that too. Next to her over here, we have Erika Smith, who is an assistant Metro editor for the Los Angeles Times. Hey, Erika. Hello. Yeah, you can have applause too. She previously worked at the Sacramento Bee, where she was a columnist and editorial board member covering housing, homelessness, and social justice issues. Before the Bee, Smith wrote for the Indianapolis Star and the Akron Beacon Journal. She's a recipient of the Sigma Delta Chi Award for column writing and is a graduate of Ohio University and a native of Cleveland. Thank you. But that's not all, because on the phone we have Gerrick Kennedy, who Ms. DuVernay referenced in her speech. Gerrick, can we hear your disembodied voice?
Hello.
Yes. Gerrick is a staff writer for the Los Angeles Times, where he has covered music and pop culture since 2009. He's on the front lines at award shows, music festivals, and has profiled hundreds of the music industry's biggest players, including Mariah Carey, Drake, Carrie Underwood, Sam Smith, Nicki Minaj, Jennifer Lopez, Diana Ross, Kendrick Lamar, and The Weeknd. In 2012, Kennedy was named the Emerging Journalist of the Year by the National Association of Black Journalists. And in 2014, The Advocate featured him in its annual 40 Under 40 list. He's also the author of Parental Discretion is Advised, The Rise of NWA and the Dawn of Gangsta Rap. Thanks, Gerrick.
Thanks for having me.
Like you're looking off into the distance. Many of you already know who Nipsey Hussle was, but some of you may not have sort of the full picture of the person that he was and why his death struck so hard. And so I think the best way to give you a small snapshot of that is to read some of Gerrick's coverage from the LA Times. This is a condensed version of one of the pieces that he wrote. Here's the thing to understand about Hussle and why his death is exceptionally devastating, not only to those of us who live and breathe hip-hop, but also reside in his birthplace of South LA. He was more than a rapper. Not that there's anything wrong with just rapping, because there isn't. Driven by a rapacious desire to reinvest in the streets that raised him and rebuild the community, Hussle became an entrepreneur, community organizer, activist, and mentor as he transformed into a rap star. His death in front of the strip mall he was redeveloping feels particularly cruel. Hussle, born Ermias Ashkadam, never shied away from the licks and stumbles that came with growing up in South LA in the 90s. Hussle made music for the street hustlers and those of us struggling to make ends meet, and he became a local hero for using the fame and fortune he got from rapping and pouring it back into the neighborhood. It's easy to root for the man who sold copies of his mixtapes out of the parking lot of a strip mall and turned right around and opened a shop in that same mall the second he could afford it. Hussle had big dreams for his hood, and it's not just tragic, but unfair that he was cut down in the middle of revitalizing a community that raised him. Those are just some of Gerrick's words about Nipsey Hussle. And so I'm going to start with Gerrick and ask you to tell us a little bit more about who Nipsey Hussle was to the community.
You know, Nipsey's importance to the community is something that I think that we are still really fully understanding, because there's so many stories that have yet to be told about his influence. But just to back up a little bit, you know, he's somebody who, you know, his rap dreams have been in fruition for the last decade. You know, this album that he broke out was Victory Lap, which he was nominated for a Grammy a couple months before he was killed. That was what put him into the mainstream consciousness. But people who were aware, who followed West Coast hip hop especially, knew who Nipsey was, because, you know, he's been putting out mixtapes for pretty much a decade now. You know, one of the things that broke him out was making the decision to do a limited pressing of his mixtape Crenshaw, and he decided to put a sticker tag on it, $100, which seems pretty steep to most people, but what he was doing was he was saying a mission of, I know the value of this work, and if you want this, you will pay for it, and people did. One of those folks was Jay-Z, who brought 100 copies of it. And so it's something that, people started to understand that he was really serious about how he was approaching his rap career from a business perspective. And even though other rappers before him have obviously known how to translate their rap career into a really smart and savvy business plan, he was somebody who that business plan was redeveloped in the streets where he came from, and he never left. And that's what made him different from everybody else.
Angel, can you tell me a little bit about how you ended up on this story and what prepared you to cover this story?
Yes, because music is not my terrain. I cover the people and all the problems that they face and the plight and the promise of South LA, which includes cities of Compton and Inglewood, as well as Los Angeles, which now is known as South LA, but people know it as South Central. And that's how Nipsey described his neighborhood as South Central. And so I actually live in the community as well as cover it. And you can see Nipsey's influence throughout the streets. He had shirts that was sold out of his store, the Marathon clothing store, that said Crenshaw, which kind of took a name of a street that might have had a negative connotation outside the neighborhood, but he took that and harnessed that. And so people restored the pride back into the community. So you saw those shirts all over. And he sold those, and he had a strip mall. And so I saw his influence. And I would drive past the store every day to work, and then his death happened. And I got a call while on a Sunday. That happens most times. Something big happens on the weekends, and I was with my family, and I was told, like, he passed away. Can you put in a few calls? And that's what I did. I called my law enforcement sources, but then I realized, like, this is a story that needs to be told from the ground, talking to the people that cared for him and loved him the most. So I got to work the next day. I said, let me tell the story about his life and legacy. And with my editor, we forged a path to talk about what he was doing with that strip mall in this area that is facing tremendous pressures of gentrification, of Black flight because of housing prices in South LA and LA around the country, really. And that he was just trying to reclaim that area and try to do something better with it, bring back stores and amenities for the community, and also keep Black people in the neighborhood. So I was like, let me tell that story. And then I got to work.
So, Erika, I'll let you pick it up from there. Can you tell me about the genesis of the coverage, how it came in, maybe how people initially wanted to cover it, and how that changed over time?
Yeah, I mean, I'm new to the LA Times. I've only been there since December. I moved from Sacramento. And, I kind of got into the story because I happened to be the night editor. That was my first night editor shift. And he was literally shot 20 minutes before I got to work. And so I spent the evening, other than talking to Angel, but, kind of bringing in all of the feeds from everybody, some of the reporters we had on the field, out there talking to people, and monitoring social media. And it was one of those things that it was clear from looking at some of the data that we had, that I think most news organizations have these days, in seeing and looking at social traffic, that it was moving from a crime story to a community story. And I can tell you that night, just looking at the data, that story had more traffic between 4 p.m. and midnight than the entire website had all day. So the story that we kept updating. So I mean, that was an early indication of how big of a story this was going to be. And I, being new to LA, I don't presume to know everything about it, but I remember not being able to sleep at night and reading Gerrick's column, actually, and then talking to Angel the next day. And we usually have our morning Metro editor meeting, and we talk about stories we're gonna do and how we're gonna cover it. And after talking to Angel and reading Gerrick's column, and again, looking at Twitter traffic, it was clear it was gonna be a community story. And so the buy-in at the initial time among the editors, we wanted to cover it like a crime story, like we've done, which normally you would do. And we had to do that story, of course. But Angel wanted to do a different story. And I thought that it was a really good idea based on just my gut and what I'd read. And so we kind of marched along this path, she and I, and she did this great story that ended up doing really well online. And we also did our crime story. But the interesting thing is now we have kind of data to back up our gut feelings about things. And we could see in real time and over the day how much better her story did, not just locally in LA, but also nationally and internationally, I would say, versus, say, the crime story that we did. And I think that was a really big clue for us for how we were going to continue to cover the story. And of course, with, Gerrick's input and Angel's, and, both of their expertise in this area, we were able to do some really good coverage. But my role was just basically trying to convince everybody else that it was a good idea.
And go ahead, Angel.
Yeah, because that first story that I was writing about the community and him revitalizing that strip mall, I thought was going to actually be a sidebar on the front page story. And it wasn't until the next day that I realized it was buried inside the story.
It was.
And it did not actually make the homepage all day, which kind of baffled me. It was on the homepage, but it wasn't center stage. It was all about the crime, small letters about him trying to redevelop the area, and then another story about him being a symbol. And I just kept questioning you why. I'm like, the data's there, people are reading it, I'm seeing it floating online, and that was a concern to me because I wanted to tell the community stories, and his story is the community stories. Nipsey Hussle is a lens into South LA and the people and the promise and all the things that are happening in the community, and I wanted to make sure that we highlight that versus the fact that, his death, his brazen murder, which was salacious, and people want to click for that, but it's also a man here and a father, and someone who was deeply cared about and valued in his community. And I thought that story was important to get out.
Let's pause here for a second and talk about sort of what's overriding all of this. The LA Times, like many newsrooms across the country, is a majority white and does not have that many people of color in the newsrooms. So can you talk, Erika first, and then we'll go to Gerrick, about how those conversations started, given that context, and then how they changed over time, especially with that data that you had?
Well, the funny thing about being new to a paper is you don't really have a lot of basis of ground rules, and most people who know me know that tact is not always my strong suit. So generally, what I think I say, and basically, for me, I know that diversity is one of those things. Like, I think probably most newsrooms these days that we want to be better about it. We want to hire more journalists of color. We want to hire more people that are LGBTQ. But, it's not always as easy as it sounds. And I know that going into this story, I think that the management, a lot of folks have been there for a long time. Some are the newer editors. But, the concept of even knowing who Nipsey Hussle was, I don't think that most of the editors even knew who he was. So that was a baseline. I think covering it differently and convincing people that we should do that is tougher. I think that being a person of color and being a little bit younger, I could make that argument a little bit better. I think the data definitely helps. I think it's a culture shift. I think that, like a lot of newsrooms, we want to broaden our audience. We want to have subscribers that are not just the typical, frankly, upper middle class, wealthy white subscribers that the LA Times right now has. We want LA as an extremely diverse city, and we need to get more of those folks around the county and around the city and around the region to subscribe, but they're not going to do that unless they feel like what they're reading reflects their community or what they say, or uses, in some cases, the language that they would use and speaks to them in that way. And so I feel like by having diversity in a newsroom, you start to get at that a little bit. And not just diversity in terms of race or ethnicity, but also in where people live in the newsroom. I think one of the big advantages for both Gerrick and Angel is they live in South LA. And so it wasn't just this story about this place and these people, it was literally their neighborhood. And I think that when you start to have people like that in your newsroom, hopefully with the combination of data so people can see it in real time, I think people start to actually listen and maybe the culture starts to change, or at least I hope that is how it goes.
Gerrick, you've been at the LA Times a little bit longer than Erika. Can you tell me about not only how those conversations went for this story, but how they've gone in the past and maybe how you've seen that change or not?
Yeah, I've been at the paper for 10 years now. The entire time I've been at the paper, I've been the only Black reporter on the music team. I am the only queer person on the music team. I'm one of 3 Black writers in all of Calendar, our entertainment section. So I've kind of had to reside in the space, not necessarily because I would want to, but because I kind of have to, which a lot of my job is explaining these things and why they're important to the audience. And it's something that early in my career I was really resistant to, because I think there were moments where my voice was really being suppressed until it was time to, come explain this gay thing to people, come explain this Black thing to people. It's, really, it has been a shift in the last 5 or 6 years when the paper has started to hire more people of color, even if they're not always Black, or if they're not always, Latino, we're still getting more diversity in these spaces. So it has allowed me to take that step back and really kind of see an opportunity to now be a voice before I have to be the voice, if that makes any sense. And so when it comes to something like Nipsey, if I can be very frank, I think if I hadn't written that first story, I don't think there would have been the interest that there was to then start to cover it from a sense. I think they did need somebody to tell them this is important, because I think that, Angel and I, we've been there the same amount of time, but we still both have to convince editors that this is something that matters. We still have to do so much work convincing, editors that this is something that matters. It's something that's really always a sexy headline and calendar, somebody's dead. I mean, we know this in newsrooms. We know that celebrity death is always going to move the needle, but I do think that, this is an opportunity to show that this is not just a celebrity death. This is something that means more. This is something that's going to hit a little bit harder. I moved to South LA last October, but also Nipsey was somebody who I spent a lot of time with. I spent a lot of time with socially. We had dinners together. We shot the shit, excuse my language, a bunch of times. I had just seen him Grammy weekend. We dabbed each other, and just the excitement in the room of like he was finally nominated after all of these years of putting his music. So this was also very personal to me. And I wasn't really I didn't care about being first or any of that, because what mattered to me most was really mattering in all of this and mattering in this conversation. And so I wanted to really illustrate what this actually means. And that does mean taking a step back to say, I know I have to explain a little bit of rap culture in this piece that I'm going to write, but I also have to explain a little bit about what he meant in the context of where he was in rap right now, but also what he meant to the city, because a city this big, a lot of folks are not going to know who he was. And that's just the reality of it. Even in his death, a lot of people didn't know, and a lot of people got really turned on to him, probably not even because of the music, but because of the things they were learning when they were reading Angel stories. And they were seeing what he meant to the community. They were starting to hear all of these stories come out of South LA, a place that they're not really paying that much attention to. If it's not a story about crime, to be frank, I mean, it's still weird that we're still in this space, but that's where we are. We've been this way in how we look at South LA for 25, 30 years now. So it doesn't change, but what does change is having reporters in newsrooms who understand it. And I think that's what really put us apart from any place else you can look. And I looked at all the coverage, and nobody was even close to what we were doing, and that was because of the fact that you have somebody like Angel who's writing about South LA, who's writing about Inglewood, who's writing about these pockets of the city where, Black life is being really affected by the changes in gentrification, all these things that coalesced in Nipsey's death. And then you had me, who is somebody who, I live and breathe hip hop. I've been in this, world for a decade at the Times itself. So I've been, at every single room that you could think of. And so they understand if I'm writing something that is coming from a place of, oh, wow, he doesn't cover every single rap artist or every single R&B artist or every single pop artist. So when he's sitting here and he's writing an appreciation, then maybe this is something that we should be considering.
Angel, Gerrick made so many amazing points right there, and I want to get you to follow up on a couple of them. In particular, this idea of what it means to be a minority in the newsroom, whether that's a person of color or an LGBTQ person. This idea that you're often being asked to, as Gerrick said, explain your people, but then when it comes to shaping the coverage in a meaningful way about issues that affect your people, sometimes you can feel blocked out of those conversations.
I actually have been fortunate enough, I'm in Metro, which is the largest section at the paper, but for years I was the only Black reporter. It's only recently we hired another Black reporter, and I'm really appreciative of that, and I keep pushing for more. And I have Erika as my editor now, and she helped me with the coverage. She allowed me to just sit back and do the work as opposed to fighting to tell the story. So I was able to get things out while people's attention was still on this, which helped carry the story longer.
I'm going to stop you there because that point is really crucial. And
you
mentioned that earlier, this idea that because you didn't have to have the fight to prove that it was a worthwhile story, you could actually focus on telling that story.
I took that energy and I wrote 3 stories in 5 days, and deeply reported enterprise stories that could take weeks. And that's because I was able to just do the work and not have to be making calls and emails saying, this is important because. And I think that made all the difference. But I've always had supportive editors in Metro who've given me the green light to tell everyone's story. I don't think I had to fight, Sometimes it was harder getting those stories because me, at first being a young reporter, trying to understand everything and getting it right, so it may have taken a little bit longer, but things happened faster when I had someone who got it and who could I can tell them what was happening and she can funnel it back to me quickly and we're on the same page. So now, I'm able to shoot a copy to her so much quicker because we've had that conversation beforehand and we're on the same page and she can do a quick edit. And then the story is shipped off as opposed to us trying to explain things to each other. So that made a ton of difference this go around.
Erika, can you talk about some of the lessons that you think newsrooms elsewhere around the country can take from the LA Times experience covering this story to how we can cover communities of color, communities that we live in, that we don't live in, or even cover big events that we sort of have that sense like, you know what, there's more to this, but maybe I don't know what.
Yeah, I mean, I think, to my other point, I think that, newsrooms make a big deal about diversity, right? We all want to hire journalists of color. We all want to hire, queer journalists. But I think what often happens, and I say this as somebody who was on the reporting side, or at least the columnist side, up until really recently, what ends up happening is you hire these people, and then when something happens, you don't listen to them. So there's a major event that happens, and it's clear that it's, something that affects this particular community. When the reporters say, or the editors say, this is what we think we should do, what happens is there's pushback. And that kind of defeats the entire purpose of having diversity, because if you don't actually take advantage of the diversity, then it doesn't actually make a difference. It doesn't show up in your coverage. And I think that what was interesting about this particular case is, for once, I was the middle manager, right? So I was the one hearing, the pushback, and I was also seeing the reporter kind of struggle in being in the position where I finally understood what was the purpose of being an editor, what purpose editors apparently serve, which is basically to kind of make sure that the coverage actually is reflective of kind of the reality. But I think the lesson that can be learned is if we're going to hire people, we should actually listen to them and guide them, and don't tell them they're wrong if there's that community. One of the things that I've heard recently is more about, particularly with the trans community, for example. So there's this idea of using the person's trans name but not using their dead name, the name that they were assigned at birth, and why that's important or not important. And if somebody who's in the LGBT community tells you that you shouldn't do this for a reason, you shouldn't push back and say, well, I think that I'm right. And I think that happens sometimes at the higher level management, but it also happens at the copy desk level, and I say this as a former copy editor. And I think that that's another challenge in our newsroom, is making sure everybody else is on the same page, because we have a lot of people that are involved in every single story, and increasingly so now because everybody is publishing to the web. So you have your print copy desk, who also sometimes does online stuff. You have your middle level editors, you have your web producers, you have your reporters, you have your editors. And if everybody's not on the same page, if everybody doesn't get it, then things fall apart. Things get changed in a story at 10:30 at night when nobody's paying attention, and they end up in print. Headlines get changed. Things become less, relevant to people and become problematic, and then people don't find out about it for hours. And I think that there is something that newsrooms can do, is to try to get everybody on the same page. So to understand that our goal is to reach a more diverse audience. To do that, we have to actually be relevant to them. We have to be sensitive. We have to understand. And I think until that really happens, we're going to have a lot of, kind of herky-jerky kind of stuff. So I don't know. I don't know if that makes much sense, but that's kind of my general thoughts.
I want to piggyback off of something Erika said. You said it's one thing to hire people of color and actually use them in a way that they're actually doing the stories that they want to tell, and explain it in a way that is important to themselves and the community, and it can defeat them. It also deflates reporters of color as well. When you have an editor give you this assignment, or you come to them with an assignment, and they don't value what you bring to the table, where they go in and tell you that's not the story, or that's not the angle, or spend a little bit more time on it, is a nicer way of saying those things that you might hear in the newsroom. And meanwhile, what you have in front of you is good. You know that you have done your best, that this is the story, that there are other stories that need to be told, but let me get this one out first. And I think Erika has helped me be able to push past that. But there's so many times where I've been, that happens too often, where there's pushback from editors on what the story actually is. And that just defeats the reporter. And they're less likely to speak up and advocate for themselves or push these stories again if they're realizing that's not what the editor wants. I think we need to take advantage of the talent that is there as well and respect what they bring to the table.
Gerrick, can you talk a little bit about what you learned from this story and your work in general about bringing new audiences to the LA Times that maybe others might be able to learn from?
You know, I think foremost what I learned through this whole process was to trust my voice. This was, you know, a situation just because of the speed of which I had to turn it around. There wasn't really a conversation about what the piece was going to be. It wasn't, you know, even a thing of like, we really need this by this time. It was, we need it ASAP. You know, I had been on a bunch of calls, but at that point I'm dealing with people who are in the camp and they're off the hospital, and like, no one is in their right mind to have any kind of conversation. So I did know from one end I was on my own, because I'm not coming at it from a metro perspective. So folks don't have to like pull it together to like give me a quote or whatever. So I just decided, you know what, I'm going to do something that's going to just really be more of an appreciation. And once I made that decision and just jammed it out, we did one quick edit. And that was one of the few times where there was no full conversation with an editor about like, this is what it needs to be, this is where you should go with it. And it was just completely, I was on my own to do something, and that was really freeing in a way, because I'm not used to that at the time, to be really honest with everybody. You know, especially not when there's these situations where, you know, frankly, this is something that, you know, our critic was supposed to do, you know, because we have this hierarchy. So the critic is the one who's supposed to write appreciation, no one else. So the fact that I'm just like, you know, I know this world, I know this person, I know this music, I'm better fit for it. You know, you're having those kind of conversations on the fly. And it was at least the one time where I was like, I truly trusted my voice and what I knew I bring to this and the expertise that I bring. And I think that's probably the biggest lesson, is to always do that.
Erika, do you have any numbers or any information about what the actual aftermath was from a business perspective for the LA Times from all of this coverage?
Well, from my understanding, and Angel knows this, is we're doing some research into this now, kind of looking at it. But I think that her stories, particularly the one that she wrote about kind of the story about how he actually died, like his brother finding him. I mean, those stories I think they're the best performing stories on our website all year, and I think maybe even the year before that, as far as traffic and in terms of subscriptions, which most of us know is kind of our new business model now. So, and on top of that, who actually subscribed are people that are normally we wouldn't get as subscribers and as readers. So it's our typical, from my understanding, our typical subscriber base is mostly on the west side of LA. So think Santa Monica, Venice, you know, some of those areas. Increasingly, we got South LA, we got some more diverse areas, and you know, inland a little bit as well, like in I think part East LA as well. But we reach people we don't normally reach. We got a lot of those people to click and to subscribe, which I think in every business model is a win for us. And if we can continue to do that, not just with Nipsey Hussle, but with other stories that reach different audiences, I think that we will continue to be sustainable, and hopefully be sustainable as a paper. So
we're going to move to audience Q&A pretty quick in just a moment. So if you guys can start thinking about the questions you might want to ask, we're going to have some mics that will pass around. But I wanted to end with at least this portion with you, Angel, talk about pipeline, because you talked about being the only writer of color for a long time. How did you?
Black reporter.
Only black reporter.
We have a lot of Asian and we have some Latino reporters. I was the only black reporter in Metro, our largest staff, our largest section of the paper, until pretty recently.
So how did you get there? And I understand the LA Times has a program around this. Can you talk about that a little bit?
So the LA Times has a program called MetPro. It's a train to hire program. When I started, it was a 6-month training program where you spend 6 weeks bouncing around from different desks. I was in business, I was in Metro doing breaking news, as well as in Metro covering education. And afterwards, you get hired on. The program is now 2 years. You spend a little bit more time bouncing around, a little bit more training, but they just release you out. You get to learn the newsroom, learn the community, and from there, that's how they hire people of color, typically, because LA Times for a long time was more like a destination paper where you would need 10 years of experience. So they would come in and get people of color, younger voices that can tell stories in different ways and can find stories in different ways. And so that's how I was brought in. Gerrick was brought in that way as well. And a lot of our reporters who write some of the hard-hitting front page stories, came in that way. And it's a great program, but like many of these programs, like they're few and far between now. And so it's important to bring in journalists of color through the traditional route, where you're hiring at the middle level, but also to keep these programs where we're actually training them. Because not only did I come in through MetPro at the Los Angeles Times, but I've been with journalism organizations throughout the years, starting from a teenager. I have in the audience one of my mentors, Athalia Knight, and she brought me on into journalism when I was like 14 or 15. And it was through a program at the Washington Post called the Young Journalism Development Project. And it became a program with Dorothy Gilliam. Mm-hmm. And that's why I'm here today. And so when you pour into underrepresented communities, underprivileged communities, you end up creating the next generation. And I know that we're at this like crossroads in journalism where we're trying to figure out how to monetize, but we also have to think about the communities we serve. And it should not just be the traditional ones that's already subscribed. Because at the LA Times, our subscription base is white and wealthy. But what my stories did, we crunched the numbers recently with one of the data editors. It said that my stories did not so well with our subscribers. Again, white and wealthy. But it brought in a whole new subscriber base. Brought in younger people. It brought in Black people. It skewed more female. And these are people who need the news as well. This is a void that has not been filled for a while. So we can do that. We can harness this time at the LA Times. But also other papers should be like reaching out and doing this as well.
I'd like to add one thing to that. I think to your point about us trying to find a way to monetize our business, I think that reaching those readers is key to monetizing our business. Yeah. Our country is becoming younger and more diverse. And if we as an industry don't figure out how to reach these people and how to get them to subscribe, we are not going to survive. So I feel like it's very much a nexus of those two things. And I feel like, unfortunately, it took somebody like Nipsey Hussle having to die, but I think in a lot of ways it proved it to the LA Times that this is the direction we need to go. And I hope that other papers are starting to understand this and do the same thing. So.
All right, we have some mics, so does anybody have any questions? And please remember that Gerrick is on the phone and a wealth of information as well. Don't everybody jump up at once now. All right. Let's start right there in the back near where the mic is.
Hey, I'm Matt Zapataski. I'm with the Washington Post. Hi. I wonder, sort of two-part question. You mentioned you got pushback from, I guess, upper management. What specifically were people pushing back against that you wanted to do? And then second part of that, have they learned lessons from how well the coverage did online, and for other crime stories, are you applying those lessons sort of going forward?
Is that for me or is that for Angel or either way?
Oh, whoever wants to answer.
I think you dealt with management. I had to deal with Erika, which was great.
So maybe why don't we have you, Angel, talk about the pushback and Gerrick as well, and then if you want to talk about what maybe the different conversations you're hearing as a result of it, Erika?
Sure. You can start. Angel.
In previous, when dealing with this story, as I mentioned, I think
he meant sort of in general, like pushback that you've had in the past.
Well, with other stories, it would take a long time to like go through what exactly the story was. Because oftentimes with enterprise stories, you got a nugget of news and you're digging deep yourself. And they often, maybe there's already a preconceived notion of what the story is. And if you sometimes when you give a story that doesn't fit that mold, it's sent back in hopes that like you can do the reporting. But if the reporting shows what it shows, you've got to continue telling the story as is and like kind of break those notions. So that's some of the pushback I've experienced as a journalist.
Gerrick, what kind of pushback have you received in the past on the stories that you've done that you feel kind of fit into this mold?
I think I've actually been a little more fortunate not to get that much pushback, usually because there's no one else there like me, so they don't really have a way to just be like, oh, we'll take this other person's word for it. I don't really run into that. I think the opposite of that is, covering primarily Black music is always really difficult when you're trying to explain nuances of things. And I think one example of that is, last year I spent 4 or 5 months working on a package on just R&B, which is not something I wasn't able to do that until I had to do a whole series on hip hop, because editors and calendar, they're excited about hip hop now. after 40 years of it being around. So, it's something where it was like, it's not necessarily pushback, but it's sort of more of a give and take thing of like, we want this because we've heard about this. And so that's, I think, probably the closest example I have to that.
And Erika, what changes have you seen in the conversations, if any?
I think that, I think to what Angel and Gerrick were both saying, I think reporters have a gut instinct about what's a story. And I think where the pushback seems to come in is more about what the editor thinks is a story versus what the reporter thinks is a story and where that middle ground is. I think that the one thing that I've seen as a result of this is that I think that at least when it comes to editors, maybe on some topics, particularly on Nipsey Hussle, this has proven that maybe what Angel said was a story and what Gerrick may have said was a story in previous iterations maybe been pushed back and been like, well, I think the story is this, where the data has shown and the results have shown that maybe they had a point. And I think that particularly on with Nipsey Hussle, and I think maybe in other areas, I think that maybe the editors are maybe not as quick to say this is the story or that's not the story. I mean, I can't say that's true for every single story that we do, but I think in some ways it was a check to say that maybe in some areas of our coverage, maybe some reporters might actually have a point. And I think this was, if anything, this particular story proved that actually was true. And so maybe in some cases people are thinking twice.
I saw somebody over here had a question. Yes.
Hi, my name is Janelle Marte. I'm also with the Washington Post. I wanted to
everywhere.
first congratulate the LA Times for having such a strong package of stories. You really had to read it and you had to subscribe if you wanted to read it all. And also to thank the Press Club for having this event to discuss the coverage. My question is for Angel. You had that really compelling interview with the brother, and it was a perspective that no other place had. Could you talk a little bit about how you gained the trust of the family and how you were able to navigate that in your storytelling?
So I've been covering South LA for like 7 or 8 years now. And in that coverage, I'm out in the community constantly. I'm not writing the story from my desk. So I'm in the coffee shops. I'm in the every place that people are, I am there. And like, I'm introducing myself, but sometimes I'm just sitting back and just being a resident. And so in that, after he passed away on a Sunday, Monday night I wrote a story, and then there was a memorial service, but I was still filing the story. And so I filed it, and then there were helicopters roving over our home. Me and Gerrick were emailing back and forth like, do you hear that? Do you hear that? And so then I let my editor know, and she was like, can you go out there and report what's happening? And I was like, of course.
That was not entirely my idea, I'm just saying. I'd just like to point that out.
Of course, we just put this story down and put the baby down. Yes, I want to go out. And there actually was a tragedy that in the memorial service, someone thought they heard gunfire. There actually was gunfire, and there was a stampede. And so I'm out there late at night, and I'm talking to people. Some people are very upset that they weren't able to go and pay their respects. And I just kind of just sit and talk to people still. And I connect with the woman who was Eritrean, and she talked about what Nipsey meant to her and to the community. And I'm like, you know what? I want to tell this story. And so the next day I was reporting the story about Nipsey Hussle's Eritrean roots and how that shaped his life as a rapper as well as a community activist. And from there, I was put into contact. It's a very small, tight-knit community that is spread out all over Southern California, but everyone knows everyone. And so everyone was talking about Nipsey's dad, how he was like a pillar in the community. And I asked someone, could you connect me with him? I want to talk to him about the story. I know he's grieving, and I don't want to by any way be disrespectful, but I would love to talk to him if he's available. Can you pass that on to me? Pass that on to him. And they did, because they had read my work, they knew my coverage, and I got a call from Nipsey's brother. He actually called me while I was reporting out the Eritrean story, and we talked for like several hours. And in that time, he just kind of, we had a very like intimate conversation. Like, I don't report like I'm just more friendlier with my sources, like, because I'm dealing with everyday people. I'm not dealing with politicians. And in that, I understand that they don't understand like the boundaries of journalism in the same way. And so I don't want to treat them in that way. And so we had this conversation, and he was very open and candid about his brother's final moments and also all the things that had transpired that day. And he was frank with me. He's like, I'm talking to you like a family member. And let's say, I respect that, so let's have this conversation. And from there, I wrote the story and I called him back like, hey, you told me some pretty intimate details. Are you okay sharing that? I am a journalist. I think this is important for people to hear. And he said yes. And we went through the details even more because in that moment, I'm just like allowing him to talk as opposed to like peppering him with questions. But we talked several times after that, and he gave me more detailed information. I asked more pointed questions, and they were planning his Nipsey's funeral, and in that time, they passed along the phone to other people in the family. And I spoke with his mother and his grieving girlfriend, and talked to his dad as well, and have been in contact with them since. And I think that's just from just my years of coverage. Like this story, I have sources I didn't even realize I had until I had to make those important calls.
Journalism. Other questions? Oh, she has a question up front here.
Hi, so you guys talk
Can you
about.
tell us who you are?
I'm Dana Jennings. I'm actually Angel's sister.
Called you out.
Yeah. So you guys talk a lot about diversity, and I know that's a growing issue within, the corporate world, journalism and things like that. My background was traditionally in public relations. But what it sounds like is the inclusion part that is missing, especially at the LA Times and maybe other newsrooms, because you hire the people, but you're not listening to them. So you have the diversity part, but you don't have the inclusion part. Can you guys touch on how the news and in general, what do you think would be better? Do you think there would be employee networks? Do you think it would be more of them letting you take the leads on stories more, covering different beats and things like that? I just want to know what you guys think on how you can increase the inclusion part.
Erika, you've been in a couple of different newsrooms. You want to talk about that?
Yeah, I think, I've been in multiple different roles in multiple different newsrooms, and I've been in more newsrooms than I can count when I've been the only Black person, and particularly the only Black person on this staff or that staff or whatever. And to me, I think a lot of it has to do with management, frankly. Like, I think I saw some statistics years ago about how, as an industry, we had no problem hiring journalists of color, like out of college, but we have a problem keeping them. And I think that's probably true of more than one industry. But I think that one of the reasons that people leave is because, not only because they get pushback on their ideas, but also because they look up in the ranks of management and there's nobody that looks like them. And they do not feel like they can kind of move forward, and they don't feel like there's a path for them. And I think, to me, I think the key, not only to the inclusion piece, is to getting diversity into the management level ranks. And that's something where we've really struggled as an industry. And I think we've struggled even more with the various rounds of layoffs that we've had in the last 4, 5, 6 years or more. And so I think that having that management level rank helps with the inclusion, because then the reporter feels like they can see somebody that looks like them, they can make an argument for their story, there's more of a conversation. And I think that those stories get told a little bit more. But until you get that in the management level ranks, I think it's just gonna be tough to get past the diversity to actual inclusion. And that is one thing that not one thing, but one of the things I really like about working at the LA Times. It's not as diverse as it could be. I don't think anybody there believes that it is. But I do feel like, at least in this current crop of management, there is some level of commitment to trying. And I recognize that, I've been in this industry long enough, and I'm cynical enough to know that it's not as easy as it seems to just hire a bunch of people of color, because you have to convince them that it's a good place to work, that all of these various things are why you would move across the country or switch jobs to work at a place. But I do think there's at least an attempt and a good spirited effort to do so, and to hopefully continue to do so. And that's nice, because I've been in a lot of newsrooms where that has not been the case. So.
And piggybacking off of Erika, it's not just seeing people in management as a path forward, but also as having advocates there. Because let's be honest, like, people tend to pull up like people like themselves, whether that's having the initiative, the drive, or they see a spark in someone that reminds them of themselves. So if we have more people that can then help others in their coverage as well as in their careers, then it brings in the inclusion part, because then you think, my voice is valued and it matters. I'm gonna speak up more, which then just has an effect where then, like, if they're speaking up more, they're getting different assignments and then they're rising the ranks. So I think it's all tied in together.
Gerrick, did you have thoughts on this?
I don't have anything to add on that one. I think it's been pretty covered well.
Okay. Any more questions? I see somebody who I can't see over here. Yes.
Hi, I'm Brenda Belton. I'm a retired educator, nothing in journalism. 73 years old, never heard of Nipsey Hussle until I saw the article. And like she said, I had to subscribe because I wanted to read it. And I would like to think that I'm not an anomaly, that there are other baby boomers who are looking at different aspects, because you have, people who look like me, who are younger, but who are giving me a whole new look at the world. And so as you begin to deal with your demographics, look at that to see, because I'd be interested to know that everybody that's coming on board are not just the babies like you all, but some of the old folks like me. So I'd be interested to see if that's coming through in your demographics.
I mean, this is such an important aspect of, yes, thank you for sharing that. Such an important aspect when we talk about, covering these underrepresented communities, is that these communities are not monolithic.
No. Absolutely.
My mother, I struggled to get her to listen to Marketplace, and there are generational difference, cultural difference, different parts of the country. And so when we're talking about covering the Black community, the Latino community, the queer community, your one Black person or your one queer person may or may not be able to cover that. So how do you, and actually, Gerrick, I'll have you talk about this, how do you kind of have that conversation in the newsroom and make sure that even within trying to cover your own community, you're covering parts of it that maybe you don't know about very well?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the fight that I run into these days is sort of this idea of like, when you become the explainer, you are this person for so long, and you like actually have to fill in the blank for every single thing, no matter how big or small. And I can't tell you how many times I'll be in, and it's like, oh, this person is a rapper and they got killed. Like, should we jump on this? And I'm like, I don't even know who this is. They don't even have music on SoundCloud or Spotify, but anybody can just say that they're a rapper. And I get that you guys are really excited about somebody that got killed, and you think that there's like some sexy story there, but I get that TMZ has it, but I don't know actually who this person is. So you just run into that so much. So you're having to spend so much time convincing them as much as you have to that something is a story, but that something is not a story. So it's sort of a battle every single day where it's like, you want them to take you serious when you come to them and be like, well, I think this and this and this is worthy, when, the last thing that they remembered is you turned down this story or this story. So it's like I'm always feeling like I'm on a tightrope in there, and especially when it comes to hip hop. And the only reason I have that is because, it is the genre of music that is the most popular right now. It is the most influential right now. So I don't have these conversations when it's pop music or R&B because, frankly, the editors don't care. But, they hear 2 years after the fact of Cardi B, they now hear about her, and it's like, oh, do you know who this thing is? And it's like, oh, she was on the cover, during Grammys, and I wrote that, and I guess you didn't see it then. So it's so much of, what you're doing is, convincing them that something is important, but also convincing them that something is not important. And that's a challenge that I sometimes don't know how to navigate, because most times you'll just hear me say, I don't think it's a story, good day. That doesn't always fly over in our newsroom. That's ultimately what it becomes. Is I said it earlier about that give and take. You're constantly having to have this back and forth. And if you have an editor that's okay doing that, then I think it's great. But when you have an editor that's like, well, I still think this is a story because my 16-year-old is into it, and I think it's great. So I don't know how to argue with somebody who's telling me I should write a story because their 16-year-old is into something. I don't know what to do to that. Sometimes, though, a lot of it's just going back and forth between things.
I would add one thing to that. Solution is to hire more Gen Xers. That's my. I'm half joking.
Straddle generation.
No, I think that there's some. One of the things that's interesting about the times right now is the age range of managers is a lot younger in places where I've been. I mean, granted, I came from Sacramento, which skews a little bit older, but there is a number, and I will put out a shout out to my generation, but there are a number of Gen Xers in management level, and it is interesting because I found that we can talk a little bit more to millennials and we can talk to boomers. We do both. And so I think there is a certain level of I get it, even if I don't understand it completely as much as this millennial or this boomer, there is a certain touchstone or point of reference where we can step to one or the other. And I do think that is maybe one of the solutions that you get And by the way, you do not look 73. I just thought I'd have to mention that. But I do think that does help in some cases where you do have people who can understand different generations and can translate, basically.
But I want to say to like her comment that as I've been writing these stories and I've been interviewing people, so many people have been telling me, thank you for telling his story. Thank you for interviewing me. Like, it's been an honor talking to you. And I'm floored by that. Oftentimes, it's so hard to get people on the phone, to get them to open up personally. And in this case, this is the one time where everyone has been so open and so available to share their life story as well as tell Nipsey's as well. And I think that is reflected in the coverage.
You have a question, sir?
How you doing? I'm Justin Tinsley from The Undefeated, and first and foremost, I want to congratulate all of you all for the coverage that you had during Nipsey's death, and right after that, it was very powerful stuff, and I imagine, obviously, living in the same city that he was from, you took it as a deep responsibility to honor him at that moment, and my question is really about you all. You can go back to the black press when Malcolm X or Martin Luther King were assassinated, or when somebody like Marvin Gaye died, or even just in the hip hop world, Tupac Shakur and Biggie Smalls. If you talk to the journalists and the editors who were responsible for covering that took a lot out of them as well, because they were very attached to those artists, because they told the stories that they tell in their music, because they're both artists in a sense. So my question is, especially living in LA, what have you done, or how did you manage to take care of yourself while reporting on that as well? Because when you're so inundated with it, when you see Nipsey everywhere, especially now, you see him on Instagram, you see him on Twitter, you see him on TV, like you're always reminded of him. But how did you take care of yourself in the process while doing that?
Can we have Gerrick take that one first? Because I know that you were very close.
Yeah, that's actually a really great question, and the first time I've been asked it. And it makes me think of a colleague of ours who had, texted to check in. He was like, I know you take these things kind of hard. And, that's when I, a couple of days into it, this is right before the service. So I was still, had been doing a ton of practice, in the days after. So I'm just a little tired. I think I quickly wrote back and I was like, I think you don't understand what it is to be on this side of it, where, I'm not, a lot of my friends who are, in politics or, in Metro or these other places where it's these folks where, yes, you might talk often, but there is no relationship. It's so much different when there actually is. So much of what my job is maintaining these relationships. It is dropping by studios. It is hearing this music. It is going to the tours. It is going backstage and talking to them because they want that presence there. So much of what my daily existence is as a music reporter is being somewhere. And that sounds, when I first started, I had no idea that was so much of the job, and so I think some people are like, oh, it just must be cool. You get to go to all these free shows. And it's like, yeah, I go to probably, 250 to 300 shows. How often I'm sitting through that show is like 5%. For the most part, I'm backstage talking to people. I'm maintaining those relationships because that's how we do our business. That's where my story ideas come from. So you do get so close to these folks in a way that it becomes, almost, the line is so blurred that, frankly, in this one, this is one of, I don't know, probably 5 or 6 artists who I've been, somewhat close to, and they've passed away. I mean, nothing was as hard as, what I thought was, Whitney Houston, who I was with her 2 days before she passed, and then it happens, and then I'm having to write about it. This is different in a way. This is somebody who was doing so much for now a part of the world where I care about, where I'm wanting to spend my life, and I am constantly reminded of him driving up and down Crenshaw and seeing the billboards even before he passed away, and those billboards are now murals. So it was just so much of being surrounded by it, being in those camps, being around those people all the time. And we had just been doing, Grammy stuff and kind of coming off of the downturn of that. So it was like sort of catching my breath from like having all this stuff back to back. And then this thing happened, and it shakes you in a way. It really affects you in such a powerful way that I hadn't really prepared myself for until it was I'm at Staples Center and I'm at this man's service, and it's, folks are texting me, and it's like a lot of my friends who are still doing this and they're detached from it in a way, and they're just like, oh, we're like roaming around, and I'm like, I'm on the floor. I'm with Snoop's camp. That's because I came with Snoop's camp, because this is the level of closeness that I have. So it's different, and so it was something where I think that was the first time that I actually fully realized he was gone, if that actually makes any sense. And it really did take, being in a space where, he's in a casket there, where before that, so much of it, you have to write these stories and you don't think about it. But living, me and Angel are really close to each other. And, the night of the memorial, we're on Slack and on text with each other, because we can hear the helicopters, we can hear the people, we can hear the sirens. So we never got to escape any of it. And so there was a way where it was, by the second or third week after he passed away, just feeling so drained by all of it. And so then when the editor is like, let's keep the story going, and it's like, well, for me, there is no story right now, because right now it needs to be a pause, because I also know the same way Angel has to know, when you are dealing with family members and you are dealing with people that are grieving, that next story for me is a little bit further down the road than it might be for someone else who is, further, has a little bit more of a distance from it all.
So drawing those boundaries was, it sounds like, a really important part of your self-care and just knowing when to say stop. What was it for you, Angel?
I was not sleeping at all after his death, and I could not figure out why. Like, I just had all this, like, it was like energy. Like, I was thinking about it in my sleep, and I was waking up and texting her and emailing her at 6 in the morning, and a source texted me at 5 in the morning, and I responded. I was like, "Are you available to talk?"
I wasn't sleeping either, so half the time I would respond.
And then it took for a coworker to tell me, she's like, "Oh my gosh, his death is affecting you. That's empathy." Yeah. Like, it is. You don't realize that. And I was like, "Whoa, maybe it is." And like, I think on another level, like I didn't know Nipsey in the way that Gerrick did, but my husband listened to his music all the time. So he was the soundtrack in our car on any kind of road trip we took. And my husband is a Black man. So it hits in a way that, knowing that my husband goes out into this world and like not knowing in what condition he'll come back in. Like, this is Nipsey who went to his work. He was at a block that was second home. And like, while his death happened under like different circumstances, you just don't know that what kind of shape, your partner's gonna come back home to when faced by so many threats. And so in that way, I wanted him to be home and to stay home. And like, so in that time, like, I was plowing ahead at work, but then I took 2 weeks off.
No, but
I took a full 2 weeks off afterwards to get myself together. And then I was like, okay, I'm ready to go again.
Yeah.
Can I want to piggyback off something that Angel said, which was, that idea of, walking out here in the world as a Black man, something that, I'm remiss to mention is, what it was like for us, and we were only a couple blocks away, and sort of being almost re-traumatized by his passing on a daily basis. You were seeing it in the neighborhoods. You were seeing, I think maybe since Michael passed, this was the first time since then that I saw people openly crying in the street. Fairly regularly, you would go to the coffee shop, and that's all people were talking about. Anywhere you went, it's all people talked about. So you were surrounded by it in a way where it was actually really hard to find those moments of self-care. And that self-care didn't happen for, a full month, which was getting outside of, South LA for a bit, taking a weekend in Palm Springs and being like, I'm not going to turn my phone this weekend.
One of the pieces that really struck me that you all did after his death was chronicling all of the other people who were killed by gun violence in South LA in the month of April, and taking that coverage and that insight that you all gained in your coverage and then amplifying it to tell that larger story. Do you have any closing thoughts before we wrap up?
I mean, Erika? I think, to me, I'm not of LA in the same way that Gerrick or Angel is, and I hope to stay there for quite some time, but I don't have quite the connection to the city that they do yet. But to me, what Nipsey Hussle represented is somebody who, in my previous, writings, I really care a lot about Black community, our community, and the way that gentrification and the way that housing prices and the way of displacement is happening. And to me, like, I looked at, this story as a way to use kind of the message and the things that he talked about so much to train and use the LA Times to hopefully talk about these things going forward. And of course, gain subscribers in the process, but also to kind of talk about these very important issues that are affecting not just African Americans, but people all over this country, and particularly in LA. And it is a pertinent and urgent thing. And I think that part of the reason our coverage connected with so many people is it didn't just talk about Nipsey, and it talked about these issues, and it got to the core of why people cared about him, and why, because he was that person that stayed in his community, that wanted to invest in his community, that kind of did the different thing that a lot of people don't do when they get wealthy and famous. And I don't know, I would hope that other papers at the very least will take, not necessarily, if are not our coverage, will understand that these are the issues. We should be connecting with people about these issues, about issues that are important to them, that they care about. And I don't know, that's kind of my whole takeaway from this. And as an editor, I want to continue to tell that story, not just of him, but also of what's happening in our community and in LA.
Angel, any quick closing thoughts?
I think Nipsey's death kind of highlighted a divide in LA. You have this part of LA that knew who he was, knew his work, knew the issues that he was talking about very intimately. And there's this other side of LA that's like mostly our subscribers who've never heard of him, who have never experienced some of these problems, who've never been to this part of South LA, to LA, which is sometimes just 8 miles from their home. And I think that his death has been a moment in time that hopefully makes the paper reevaluate how we cover these communities, and as well as think largely about coverage outside of just at the LA Times. But are other news organizations also holding themselves accountable to make sure that we're ingrained in the community and we're like telling stories not just to our readers, but in a way that our readers and other people are all inclusive in it and they're learning something as well?
Gerrick?
I mean, I think everything has been held off so well, but one that I have that's pretty unrelated is just the importance of having this space to have this conversation, because even something like this, I think, from a lot of the conversation I've been having with Angel and now, Erika, who I've gotten to know a little bit more through this, is, it's even hard for us to have the conversation of not only just what this work meant, but like how it made us look in our newsroom. Like nobody on my team has ever came to be like, oh wow, this is really great that we had this. Or like some of the stuff gets so lost, and some of it I do think a lot of it comes to the fact that they might get that it's important, but they might not care that it's important. Mm-hmm. And so I think it's really great that we've been able to like have this space to have this discussion, just because it does remind me of my frustrations, that I've been going through lately with just how, we've been trying to think about this coverage, which is what is next? What does this mean? Are we going to change the way that we do things moving forward? I'm not really convinced of any of those things yet, because some of the things haven't changed. I'm still having the same types of conversations around writing about, cultural things in that newsroom. So it was really great to be able to have this discussion. So I'm really appreciative of that.
Gerrick Kennedy is a staff writer for the Los Angeles Times. Angel Jennings is a reporter for the Metro section. And Erika Smith is the assistant Metro editor for the Los Angeles Times. Thank you all, and I'll turn it back over to Julie.
I want to add my thanks, and Gerrick gave me sort of the perfect transition by talking about the conversation. We're sort of in this meta mode now, but I was in Chicago last week with a group of journalists as part of an Emerging Leaders Institute, largely journalists of color, but not entirely. And we were talking about some related issues, and somebody said, it's so important that we're having these conversations. I'm so glad we're having these conversations. And please also know that your learning is my labor. So I want to thank you guys for the learning and the labor. Angel, Erika, Gerrick again. I want to thank Kimberly as well, our wonderful moderator. I want to thank the Institute team. They were in the aisles for a minute, but Andy Kohler, who helped develop this program, and Jim Coonan, who actually just started today and jumped in and said, how can I help? So welcome and thank you. And the press club team, who has done such a great job making sure everybody here has a good experience and is feeling welcome and comfortable. If you have not been to the press club before, please, after this, find either me or Bill McCarran, who I think is still here. Yep, Bill, can you stand up? Find Bill McCarron. He can help you learn more about the Press Club. He's the executive director of the Press Club. And we thank the club very, very much. I also, in a moment, am going to invite everybody to a reception upstairs in honor of this program, supported by the LA Times, who we also thank for making this program what it is. But before I do, I actually want to talk for a minute about somebody who's not in the room. You may have noticed some of us wearing buttons that say "Free Austin Tice." Austin is the only U.S. journalist who is being held abroad. He has been detained for 2,419 days in Syria, almost 7 years. He was taken while he was reporting for the Washington Post and McClatchy. The U.S. government believes Austin is alive and is working very hard to bring him home. Austin's family has been fighting for his freedom, and we stand with them, and we hope that you will too. So if you would like a pin on your way out, there is a bowl of them. You can also see Austin's Syria photography in the lobby, and stay tuned for more that you can do to help show your support. So thank you guys again. Please do join us upstairs. You should have 2 free drink tickets, so you can start that way and then keep going if you would like. And thank you guys again for supporting this program.